I found myself thinking, when I was thinking of my last opportunity to talk with you, what it is I would like to leave with you as sort of a final impression of what my year's ministry with you has meant. And I'm sure if I just went around and asked you, a number of you would say, well, you talk a lot about science and spirituality, and I do. And you talk about evolution quite a bit, and Brother Teilhard de Chardin, I remember that you represent that. And you also have had us walk through the Garden of Eden several times. Those of you who've been a part of it know that I kept referring back to that because that's such an important allegorical story. But what, of all things that I would like you to say, yeah, I remember when that guy Pierson was here, and this is what he was trying to tell us. This is what I'm going to talk about today. I want to tell you that there is no way that I could tell you from my experience how absolutely personal is your relationship to God. And I mean, that's old-time religion. That's what it used to be about, you know. God was a man in the sky, and that man in the sky was looking after you. But of course, then we have wised up, and we now have metaphysics that say, wait a minute, you are a mind being, and the mind is all-powerful. And as you shape and use your mind, you can build your life. And there is a validity in that, a very real validity, and it's important. But unfortunately, it has caused a lot of people, I believe, and I've seen it, I think, in our own unity movement, where we've shifted to what was known as sort of religious science. And that is that I am in charge of my life. That God has given me this power. And, oh yeah, God is everywhere present, but it's up to me. And I'm wanting to say to you, my conviction is that the work that we do in mind is primarily not to shape our lives. It is to make ourselves a better channel for God to work through us to make our uniqueness meaningful in the world and to take care of us. So how can I leave this so strongly in your mind you'll never forget it? And of course, what I thought of was several of my old chestnuts. I mean, if you hear them over and over again, I mean, you're bound to remember them a little bit. The guy bored me. He kept telling the same stories. But you may not have heard them all. Let me begin with this one by telling you why I feel I have to leave and go back to Unity Village. I have ideas already that have been told they'd like me to help with, but I don't think that's necessarily what I'm going back for. I don't know. I just have to go. And I relate that to two other times in my life. One, when we left Hawaii to come here, because as I've told you, Dorothy and I swore, we'll never leave Hawaii. This is paradise. And it is. But we came because of this incredible urging from within. And when I got religion, in quotes, in my 20s, after my divorce, as I've shared with you in other talks, I had that same urging that I had to share this message. So when I told the people in the oil company that I worked for I was leaving, I got a word that I was to come to Ashland, Kentucky, which the headquarters were, and to see the family that founded and was the chairman of the board of the corporation, which a little later was the 12th largest corporation in the country. I had gone to school with their son, and that's why I was working for them, because the son we both wanted to change the world. We thought we were going to go in politics to do it. So in one of our conversations, he said, I'll go to work for Standard of Ohio, because, you know, Dad knows the hymn. He says, you go to work for Ashland Oil, which was his father's company that he had founded. And so I said, sounds like a great plan. So I did that. But then I got religion to say, so the word got back to Paul Blazer and his wife, who were my best friend's parents. But what had happened is my best friend had gone into the army and was killed the first day in battle. And so anyway, I was called back to the Blazers, and they had dinner for me, and afterwards I went into the study with Mr. Blazer, and I can still remember sitting there, you know, and he said, you know, Phil, I lost Stu. And he said, I'm counting on you. I was really figuring you were going to go on with the company. I sometimes think, you know, how do you do that? I just said, I'm sorry, Mr. Blazer, I got to go. It was so strong. Now, some of you here have had that same kind of movement. When you are attuned to spirit, it is beyond rationalizing. So anyway, I left and started to look for the ministry that I was going to now carry this new message that I had discovered all by myself. Nobody knew, as far as I was concerned, that Jesus said we were all like him. Of course, as you well know, there were many, many metaphysicians and philosophers from way back that had come to that thought, but I'd never come across it, and so I was wild to go out and spread this word. So I started looking for a ministry that I would feel at home in. I started the Episcopal ministry where I was attending the church and had been nominated for the bishop's representative for the state of Kentucky, lay representative. And so I started there, but the bishop and I really didn't hang together too well. So then I went to the east to live with my folks while I went around to various schools and to relate to the deans. And I couldn't relate with anybody. So in an amazing way, I suddenly was asked to go to work for Standard & Poor's Corporation. And so I went to work for them as a regional representative for the state of New York. And thanks to incredible events or things that I did, which I didn't do, that God did through me, I had really shaken them up in New York, and they said, wow, this guy is going to be something great. But I wasn't happy at all. And so one day I prayed with all my being that God would get me out of this. I went home to my folks' house in Connecticut, and they said, oh, your mail is there. And I opened up the mail, and there was that kind invitation. Uncle Sam would like you to come and join him. I got drafted, and you all have heard that story. And I was drafted, and I went overseas. So I spent about 14 months overseas. I came back, and now I said, I'm not going back into business again. I don't belong there. I have a message. I've got to find a ministry. So I set out again. I ended up turned out to be my last effort to find a ministry that I could relate to. I went down to Washington, D.C., where I had a good friend and a lot of good connections there. But I also knew that there was a big Unitarian church there. It was so big that they had two churches, and the minister gave his talk, and the other congregation sat and listened to him. So he had several thousand people, which in those days was pretty big. That's what you can do. When you overflow here, you get another building and pipe your sound in here. But in any event, I met with him, and again, I just didn't feel the connection. So that night, I was staying with my friend. Oh no, I forgot to tell you. My friend had wonderful connections. He was a friend of the Eisenhowers, who was the president at that time. Oh, and by the way, he was the one that said to me, you know, when he was visiting, he was a friend of the nephew, and so they had entry to the White House. He said, we were in the Eisenhower's private quarters, and he said, guess what he was Catholic, but he said, guess what I saw on their night table? A daily word. Yeah. And I'd known that, later I learned, of course, that Ike's brother and his wife were very much into unity. But apparently, so were the Eisenhowers, and I'd like to think that he carried the daily word through the World War II with him. In any event, he had a lot of good connections. He arranged for me to meet with the head of the Red Cross, arranged for me to meet with the head of the, I won't tell you which one of the political parties, And I had lunch with these gentlemen, you know, and we talked and all, but nothing clicked. So I went home that night, and my friend had some other guys over, and they said, we're all going out, come on. I said, no, I don't feel like it. I'm going to stay home tonight. So I stayed there in this apartment alone. And I can remember that it was close to 10 o'clock at night, and I was still fairly Episcopalian, and I decided to go to bed, so I got down beside the bed and I prayed, and I remember I said, God, somebody must need me. Somebody must need me. Those were my words. And got in bed. I was in bed about 5 minutes when the phone rang. I thought, should I answer that? And I thought, well, it might be my friend Bill calling me, so I better. So I went over and said, hello? And this voice said, hello, is Phil Pierson there? I said, yeah, this is Phil Pierson. He said, Phil, this is Bill Darling. Well, Bill Darling was vice president, general sales manager for Standard & Poor's. Well, Standard & Poor's, as most of you probably know, is one of the most influential corporations in the country. So here's the vice president at 10 o'clock at night calling me. And what do you think his first words were? I need you. I'm telling you the absolute truth. I'm not glossing this up. I had been on my knees and I said, God, somebody must need me. And within 10 minutes, the phone rings, and Bill Darling is saying, Phil, I need you. Now, I tell you that story because how more intimate can spirit come than that? And it isn't because I'm unique or special. Maybe I'm unique only in the sense that I've always tried to work at being nice. Haven't always made it, but I've tried it. But seriously, I'm not famous, I'm not great or anything else, but I have always had, since I was a kid, this connection with, first I didn't know who God was, I probably thought he was like a man. But gradually, of course, after I read what I discovered about Jesus, I began to think of God as something much bigger than a human. And of course, as I've come into unity, realize God is universal mind. We live and move and have our being in God. And what I'm trying to share with you today, that relationship is so personal. I mean, it's just like Cherie and I being here together in Roseville. I mean, it's easier to say, well, that could have happened. It was a nice happenstance. But when the guy's calling you at night at 10 o'clock, giving you back the words you just said to God, that's pretty personal. Let's see, I got one more story I want to tell you of that nature. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, what I did was, when I heard that word, I said, how soon do you need me? Because I knew I couldn't. It must be the way to go when he used my very words. Bill needed me. So he needed me. And he needed me to be what I was before, only this time instead of New York State, it was most of New England and part of Canada, which is a big area. So he said he needed me right away, so I was in New York in 2 days, and I was in the office in New York, sort of reminding myself of all of the activities involved in this. Sitting in my office, and a guy came in, stuck his head in the door, and said hello. This guy had my job just for the city of New York. And of course, that's the center hive in our country for this kind of work. And he was somebody who made a lot of money, very prosperous. And he wasn't too popular because he had a way of telling everybody how they should go about living their lives. And so I remember looking up and thinking, well, if I just say hello and put my head down in my book that I'm looking at again, he'll go away. But trying to be a nice guy, I said, hi, come on in. So he came in. Right away, of course, he started to tell me, he says, you got a big territory. He said, you just need a place to hang your hat. He said, have you ever thought of saying a YMCA? I thought, YMCA? Why would this guy, you know, living at the level he lives, why would he be thinking of YMCA? And when I'd never been in a YMCA, and I thought of a place like barracks. Anyway, that's what he said. And he went on after that and talked, and he left. So then I'm out in my territory, and I'm stopping at places like country clubs and say, do you have private rooms here? And, you know, I was looking for a rather grand place to hang my hat. And I'd totally forgotten that conversation because it was ridiculous. And I'm driving back through Massachusetts back into Connecticut, where I was still staying with my folks. And I was going through the town of Beverly, Massachusetts. And have you all heard this one before? Okay. Anyway, I'm sitting at a stoplight in the middle of Beverly, Massachusetts, thinking to myself, I was born in this town and I've never been back here before. And I'm sitting there thinking that, and I happened to glance over to the left, and here was a red brick building, and it said, YMCA. And boy, again, all the bells went off. I thought, my gosh. And I looked over, and there's a parking place right over there. So I pulled in the parking place. I walked in, and I said, do you have private rooms here? And the guy said, well, sure. I said, with private baths? He said, sure. I said, well, can I see one? So anyway, I looked at it. It was fairly sterile, but it was very well located for my region and everything. And I said, well, I'll take this room. And so I went downstairs, and there on one little table they had in the foyer as you came into the hall was a card, and the card said, Unity class here on Tuesday night. I thought, Unity, where have I heard of that? Oh, that's right, I think my mother takes a magazine from that Unity. Well, I'll go to that class. So I arranged to be there on Tuesday night. And I went into the classroom, and there were probably 15, maybe 20 people, in quotes, older people. And I'm still in my 20s, you see. And so I sat down there, and this beautiful little lady named Edna Titus, Unity minister. She looked like a Dresden doll kind of person, you know. But she talked so sweetly and softly, and she led us in meditation. I'd never been in a meditation, you know. As an Episcopalian, I pounded my chest a little bit and said, forgive me my sins, God, and that was prayer work. I don't mean to pick on the Episcopalians, but I love them. But in any event, she said, we're going to now have a meditation. We meditated for about 15 minutes. We blessed the city, we blessed the country and the world, and I really found that quite moving. So I went out, and this is the truth, I went out, I shook her hand, and I said, thank you very much, I enjoyed this. I went out the door. She never asked me my name, nothing. So the next week, though, I made a point of coming out of the territory to be there on Tuesday night. I went into the room, and here was a darling little man standing there, and he introduced himself, and he said, I'm Mrs. Titus' husband. I'm a licensed Unity teacher, and I'm filling in for her tonight. And I said, oh, that's good. I went over and sat down. I was the first one there. And I sat down, and he was in the back of the room, and then as I was sitting there, suddenly I was aware he was walking up to me, and he came up to me, and he said, my wife said, if you were the young man that was here last week. I said, yeah, I knew I was the only young man that had been there. I said, yeah, that's me. He said, she said to give you this. And he handed me this pamphlet. And I looked at the pamphlet, and it said, how to become a Unity minister. Now, I've been searching for 3 years for a ministry. And somebody is guided out of one little brief exchange to say, give that man this pamphlet. So anyway, in a matter of weeks, I had flown out to Unity Village because I didn't know anything about Unity, and so I had to go look them over. So I flew out there, and some of you have heard that story. First woman I met there, her name was Dorothy. I won't tell you the rest of that story, but that was our first meeting. Well, I will tell you that story. Oh, no, I can't tell you that story. Okay, I will tell you that one. I arrived there, and they used to have a bus stop, and I'd come in at the downtown airport in Kansas City, and they ran buses then, and every place had bus stops, and Unity had its own little bus stop right in front of Unity Village. And you went in there, and I picked up the phone, and it went to the tower there where they had the old-fashioned switchboard. And anyway, I said I was there, and I was wanting to talk with someone about going into the ministry, and she said, well, almost everybody's gone, but there's one man here who can help you. And so they put a fellow named Parker Stokes on the line, and Parker said, well, come on over to the tower. So I went over to the tower. He said, you know, we're glad you're here, and we certainly are happy to talk to you, but he said, you know, the inn is closed, and there's no place for dinner, and I'd take you to dinner, but I have an invitation to dinner. And he said, just a minute. And he went over, and they had the old public phone on the wall over there, and I could hear him talking, and he said, well, this fellow showed up, and he wants to talk about going to ministry, and I thought maybe I could bring him along. And then there was a long silence, and finally he hung up, and he said, I'm sorry, our hostess doesn't seem to think that it's in order for you to come with me to dinner. But she said, take you to Lee Summit. Lee Summit was a little dinky town. And she said, you can have dinner there. He said, you can have dinner there, and then I'll pick you up, and you can have dessert with us. So I said, okay. So anyway, he took me to this little tiny bar, not bar, but what do you call it? Like a cafe, a little cafe. So anyway, I ate in 20 minutes at the most. And then I waited, and I walked around Lee Summit. You could see the place from all around Lee Summit. It was so small. I walked around. Finally, he shows up, and I go out there, and we went up the door and knocked, and the door opened. Here's this lady standing there, and she's the hostess. And so she welcomes me and said, why don't you go in and join my husband? And they had this doctor from the University of Alabama they were entertaining, and they were quite impressed. And that's why I guess this hostess didn't want me to come in, because this hostess apparently wasn't a great cook, and she was a little frightened about cooking for him and didn't want to cook for this guy. So anyway, she said, you go in and talk to them. So I went in and talked to them and had dessert. Later I learned that the hostess said to Parker Stokes, who had brought me, he said, why didn't you tell me he looked like that? And Parker said, like what? She said, I don't know, he was just different. And you know now who I'm talking about. That was my first introduction to Dorothy. And I never let her live it down that she kept me waiting all that time. Anyway, the personal touch of all is like, I said we were going to be here a little longer. This is my last story. When I went in and talked to the university, to Dorothy's first husband and the professor from the University of Alabama, they were talking about reincarnation and the 12 powers of man. My Episcopal self said, what the dickens have I gotten into here? So the next day, I had an interview with James Dillett Freeman. And I quickly said, you know, Mr. Freeman, I really don't think I belong here. And he said, oh, why is that? I said, well, last night I was at the O'Connors, and they were talking about reincarnation and 12 powers of man. I said, I don't really relate to that. And of course, you don't know Jim Freeman, but he's of course, you probably know him as one of the great poets. in the world. Anyway, Jim said, those O'Connors. He said, you don't have to believe that stuff. You don't have to believe that stuff. I said, oh, I don't? He said, no. And then we talked about the basic concepts of positive thinking and all those things, which I definitely related to from my understanding of Jesus' message. So I always accuse Jim of being the reason I am in unity, because otherwise I was out of there and on my continuing search. So anyway, that story, and I got so many stories like that say this mind, this universal mind that we live in, knows this soul. And if you relate to that connection, as I've encouraged you to do by loving God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, not that you can do that perfectly, but if you just try, I guarantee you that your life will unfold for you. You won't have to make it happen. It happens to you. Your job is to follow through and to be more usable by developing your 12 faculties of mind. The more you do that, the more God can access you and lead you into a purpose in life that's meaningful for others and take care of you in all the ways that matter. My final word is, remember, it took me 3 years to find the ministry. And I was wanting it for 3 years. And I'm telling you that because it's happened on other occasions in my life. It takes time sometimes for Spirit to work out the synchronicity of everything to take you where you belong. Let's close our eyes for just a moment and try to capture the feeling of this magnificent truth. It is awesome to realize that the mind that has created the universe, the mind that has conceived us and brought us forth, cares for us, as Jesus tried to tell us. And oh, blessed presence, we give thanks for this truth. We give thanks that we can receive the love and guidance that you hold for us and be a blessing to our world and to those we share our life with. Thank you, God. Amen.